Chapter 4. Share the truth at work in a proud and confident way. Work comprises the venues in which we meet and interact with most people in our lives who are not of our faith. Most of us spend a lot of time at work, and yet it is broadly believed that talking about the church with others at work is awkward and often not appropriate. This chapter has two simple purposes. First, I want to show how critical it is that we learn how to share the gospel at work. Of all the battles in the war that we are fighting against Satan, this is a big one. And in many ways, we are retreating from this battle, ceding this venue to the adversary. My second purpose is to review the obvious. The way that Heber C. Kimball did missionary work. Standing on a box in the public square and giving a sermon is one way to do the work, but it is not the only way. There are other ways to be bold and direct in sharing the gospel that work much better at work. Some will say, after reading this chapter, that Clayton Christiansen can share the gospel at work because his life is very different from mine. He has become somewhat successful in his profession. Nobody will fire him if he talks about the church at work. I'm in a very different situation, working my way up from the bottom. If I say some of the things that Clay says, I'll get fired, or at a minimum, they'll label me someone who is different. It's hard to know whether indeed Clay is an unusual case. All I can say is that I have had 4 different careers, 7 years as a graduate student, 5 years as a consultant, 5 years as an entrepreneur, and now 20 years in academia. In each, I was not prominent or successful in the beginning, and in some of them, I left those professions in obscurity too. But in each profession, I have tried to share the gospel with as many people as I could, regardless of my position. In every job, I've tried to learn what works and what doesn't in sharing the gospel, so I might be a better missionary. This is what I offer to you in this chapter. I say with conviction at the outset that when Christ said, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you," in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, he meant what he said. I have felt literally that my personal abilities have grown beyond my normal abilities could otherwise have been, because I have sought to contribute to building the kingdom of God, even while I have been at work. A paradox framed by Satan. Because work is where we can most readily meet and engage in conversations about the gospel, Satan is very committed to stop this from happening. To convey how Satan stands in our way, I'll start this chapter by recounting a conversation I had with Satan or one of his colleagues. Don't be alarmed. Every time Satan tempts us, we are having a conversation of sorts as he speaks to our spirit, trying to convince us to do something wrong, and our spirit says in turn that we are not going to do what he suggested. I have, with apologies to the renowned Christian author C.S. Lewis, attempted to replicate the style of his wonderful book, The Screwtape Letters. It is a conversation in our minds that occurs many times every day between members of the church and the demon who is trying to convince us not to do what is right. I'll give this particular adversary the name of Sharp Fork. Wait a minute. I thought to Sharp Fork, what you're telling me is that when I'm at work, I should not talk to anyone about my beliefs? It isn't politically correct, and people will be offended if I do. Religion must be a private affair. Do I have it right? Clay, you have it exactly right, Sharp Fork responded. But Jesus Christ wants me to share his gospel with everybody, including those at work. Of course he wants this, Sharp Fork retorted. Who wouldn't? Well, the problem is this, I complained. Suppose I follow your advice and don't talk to anyone about the gospel at work. For 60 hours each week, 5 days times 12, including commuting, are you putting missionary work out of bounds, right? The problem then is that on Saturday, I'm supposed to spend time with my family, and they're already members. And on Sunday, I spend time with my family at church, where everybody's also members. So what you're saying to me is that except for those 7 days every week, I can share the gospel with others, right? Exactly, Sharp Fork answered. That is the beauty of it. Although most of us have not framed it in as such, almost all of us have had this conversation. And this, in turn, causes us to feel that we face a paradox, knowing that sharing the gospel with others would please the Lord, and yet not seeing a way to do it. If the prohibition against talking about religion at work were a preference of executives, then different companies would have different views on it. And if the injunctions against religious discussions were based in a worry that they would hurt employees' productivity, then discussions about others' beliefs, like politics, ethnic differences, sports, and so on, would also be viewed as detracting from productivity in the workplace. The fact that the prohibition applies only to religion, and that the ban of religious discussion seems to be in force at nearly every workplace, leads me to believe that this particular cultural belief is the work of Satan. I see no other plausible explanation. Why does it matter to Satan what we talk about when we're at school or work or school? It is a continued attack in the war that Satan initiated in the heavens against God's plan of free agency. Having lost the first round in the premortal existence, Satan has a different strategy for foiling free agency on earth. For God's plan to be fulfilled, each of us needs to be confronted with the chance to choose between good and evil. Otherwise, we could not act for ourselves. As Lehi noted, "Wherefore the Lord God gave unto man that he should act for himself. Wherefore man could not act for himself, save it should be that he was enticed by the one or the other." Knowing that God's plan required that Satan be allowed to tempt us, how can Satan use this to his advantage in his continued war against free agency? He simply needs to convince the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that it is awkward and politically incorrect to talk about God's plan with others at work. If Satan achieves this objective, then many of God's children will be enticed by one, Satan, and not the other, members. And it will be harder for people to choose the right. Satan often appears to be winning this round of his war against free agency. Gary Lawrence and I independently have observed that far less than 10% of the saints of God are inviting their neighbors, classmates, and work colleagues to learn of the gospel of Jesus Christ. People can't act for themselves if the Latter-day Saints close their mouths, and this is exactly what Satan is accomplishing. This is a big deal. Illustrations of how to share the gospel at work. Recognizing that the fear of talking about our beliefs is a construct of Satan has given me courage. I acknowledge Satan's threats about discussing beliefs at work, and you should too. But do not be deterred. What I have learned about in this process is that there are two fundamentally different ways to be a missionary, through word and through deed. The first is to explain what the gospel is and how it has been restored to the earth. The second is to explain the gospel by overtly using it to solve important problems at work. Both ways give you a chance to testify. By word. When we use the words share the gospel, our instincts often are actually to share things. Homemade cookies, pass-along cards, copies of the Book of Mormon, and so on. This mode of sharing has been hard for me to initiate at work because it disrupts rather than fits into the flow of my work. This way of sharing at work brings attention to the actions themselves and can actually even detract from the content of the gospel. A better way I've found to share by word is to put my testimony and my life story online. It fits with the flow of work more easily because I can say it on my time, and others can read and think about it on their time. If I then follow the principle discussed in chapter 2 above, to mix every conversation, religious and LDS words, mix into every conversation, religious and LDS specific words, I can refer my coworkers to what I have said online. Many times every week, colleagues respond to my use of LDS specific words by saying, "I believe in God too," or "I'm a believer as well." I then can respond, "Aren't you glad that we believe in God? I sure feel sorry for those who don't." In fact, a bit ago, I summarized my current thoughts about faith and put them on my website. Here's the URL in case you are interested. I'd love to get your feedback. Have you ever done something like this? And so on. As a general rule, a large majority of people at work actually do believe in God. The minority who have decided that there is no God, or that discussions about religion are out of bounds, have sometimes imposed the opinion of the few upon the will of the many. I have found, as a consequence, that if I have the courage to use religious words in my language at work, and do it in a normal, matter-of-fact way, I actually free many of my colleagues from the same shackles that originally had constrained me. Within the last year, 2 presidents of significant universities in the Boston area independently thanked me for speaking about God openly. Both described truly feeling isolated by the vocal atheists in their institutions, who declare that faith and religion are out of bounds. Even at a secular institution like mine, I have found so many who are eager to discuss their faith in God that I literally could spend hours every day with just a fraction of those who are anxious to discuss the gospel of Jesus Christ. In most instances, this method of sharing the gospel has worked because I could initiate our first communications when it fit for me, and the interested parties have been able to listen when it fits for them. Then it doesn't disrupt things at work because we know some of the issues that we have in common. By deed, sharing the gospel by deed rather than by word. The second way to share the gospel at work is to use the gospel explicitly to solve problems that we encounter. Almost always, these circumstances entail teaching others. Some happen when we are standing in front of a class. More often, however, teaching entails one-on-one explanation of how to do something, how to be more successful, how to solve a problem, to communicate better, and so on. Most teachers dictate away they give their students a step-by-step checklist of what needs to be done. Good teachers often illustrate the instructions with stories. In fact, a key reason why the Savior was such a magnificent teacher is that he used metaphors, stories, and parables to illustrate key points. Mustard seeds, sparrows, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, all help us visualize what he wants us to do. As a result, whenever I'm in a teaching situation, I try to find a story about something that we do or have done in the church to illustrate what we need to do at work. Following are 3 personal experiences to show you how you can use the gospel to address common challenges. Use ministering in employee plans. Several years ago, I went on a consulting assignment with a huge European company that makes branded personal care products. It employs hundreds of thousands of employees, and its products are in most homes in the world. The particular issue that we were wrestling with was this: new incremental products whose plans promised results within 2 years or so always received a higher priority than products that might be more stable and important over their lifespan. The company simply could not make investments or innovative products that would bear fruit only over a longer term. A key culprit, we decided, was a system that identified high potential employees in the company. Smart, capable, committed junior managers in a sophisticated, competitive system. These were essentially anointed as those who would lead the corporation 10 and 20 years in the future. To prepare them, a plan was established for each of these high potential managers. A plan that would send them in 2-year stints as managers in subsidiary companies in nations around the world. These rotations entailed assignments in marketing, new product management, manufacturing, finance, and other areas. The hope was that through the sequence of assignments, the high potential employees could develop a sophisticated sense of how the corporation operated around the world and how the functions and components fit together into the whole. When I asked my host how the sequence of assignments was determined, he answered that about 18 months into an assignment, their superiors conveyed to rank these junior managers according to what they had accomplished in the current assignment. There were plum assignments and pedestrian ones. The high potential managers who did their best in the current assignment got the best assignments in the next round. This meant that within 8 to 10 years, 5 or so managers were clear leaders in the class and had so much momentum that they were moving farther ahead of the pack in the race that would determine the next CEO. There's your answer, I said to my host. If there's a great innovation that won't bear fruit within 18 months, no high potential manager would propose it. On his watch, in the assignment, his record would show costs that had been incurred, but little to show for them within the 18-month window. So the high potential system penalizes investments on long-term possibilities and rewards. Short-term mentality among your most promising managers. This was a sobering revelation to my host. I then asked, so every year you select from the entering class the high potential managers. What happens to the rest? Do they have potential? And if so, how do you cultivate it? The answer was obvious. These have potential too, but he maintained that with hundreds of thousands of employees, they could not establish and monitor a personal development plan for all of them. So everybody else needs to sink or swim. Occasionally, one of them does so well that we admit them into the high potential pool late. I said, I have an idea for you as a mechanism for developing and monitoring a career plan for many more of the hundreds of thousands of employees. As you might know, I am a member of the LDS, or Mormon Church, we have exactly your problem, but at an even larger scale. We don't have any professional ministers who operate the church. We teach and care for one another, but this means that we all need to learn how to lead, and learn who needs what kind of help or development. One way to do this is through programs that we call ministering. We spent the next 4 hours talking about how these programs work in theory and in practice in the church, and how a similar program might be implemented in this company. The concept? Every employee could have 2 others that they had a responsibility to keep their fingers on in his or her pulse to be sure that everything was working well. We decided to call these companions and home teachers or ministers in the company for short. Importantly, each companion would formulate a career plan for 2 or 3 other co-workers that they were assigned to watch over. Most employees had no ambitions to become the next CEO, but almost everyone wanted to learn, grow, achieve, and get more responsibility and recognition. Each companionship would develop a plan for those that they worked with to help them achieve these things. The plan could be given to the HR office, and every month, each companionship would report back to the head of HR how well the plan for each employee was working. This was one of the most exciting discussions I have ever had about the church. My host was extraordinarily insightful. At one point, I asked him, "Who would you assign to teach the CEO, the executive vice president?" "No," he replied. "One would be a salesman, and the other would be a scientist in a new product development." At another point in the discussion, we were looking at an organizational chart of the church with its headquarters, stakes, and wards. My host pointed to the box labeled Elders Quorum President and asked, "What does this guy do?" I responded, what they uniformly do well is organize crews of members to move people with the U-Haul trucks and in and out of apartments in the spring and fall in Boston. Beyond that, it's variable. My host then wrote next to this Elders Quorum President box, Chief HR Officer. He said, "I actually think I might implement this home teaching in part of my company. This is a great idea. I'm not sure that I want to be called like a bishop rather than a CEO, however." I responded, "If you do this, then you should get baptized into the LDS church so that you can help us make the program work better." "I might," he replied. "I just might." I did not set out to explain the church to my host. Rather, I used the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ to help him solve a problem. He learned more about the church than I ever would have imagined he would. And at several points in the discussion, he and I felt the Spirit guiding us to see and understand things that we normally could not have seen. What this CEO felt and saw is that the gospel actually works. Counseling Jack. My second story is one of counseling. This occurred when Jack, a former student of mine, visited me in hopes that I could help him get a job. 7 years earlier, the CEO of his company had retired, and Jack, as vice president, had felt that he would be the next CEO. But Wendy, whom he had never met, was brought in from the outside and put in charge instead. Wendy was driven to maximize profits. When she cut expenses to the bone to do this, This included literally zeroing out their entire budget for developing next-generation products. Her relentless focus on costs resulted in a 6-fold increase in profits. Wendy's track record of restoring companies to prosperity was broadly viewed as brilliant, and 3 years after taking the CEO position, she was lured away by a very attractive salary to run a bigger company. Wendy's timing was uncanny because the next quarter, Jack's company announced that revenues had dropped by nearly 10%. The result of Wendy's not having invested in new growth products. The board asked Jack to take the helm, with charge to get the company growing again. Doing this entailed building a R&D capability again, but this was too little, too late. The company's stock price tumbled. The company was acquired, and the CEO of the acquiring company told Jack he was no longer needed. Hence, Jack needed my help. These injustices consumed Jack. He was mad at the board for hiring Wendy instead of him. He was very angry with Wendy, of course, because Jack had essentially been punished for Wendy's mismanagement, even while Wendy was rewarded. "Clay, I need a job," Jack said. "In every interview, they assume that the company tanked under my watch. I tried to explain that this was the fault of the prior CEO, but so far, I just can't escape this legacy." I said, in listening to Jack, "I feel it. You are really mad. What I worry about is that some of the people you're interviewing with likely will feel it too, because they can't gauge who you really are. They might be thinking, is this just an angry man? How is he going to work in our company? I continued, I try to read the scriptures every morning when I get here, just to be sure that my head is screwed on right for the day ahead. I read something just a few days ago that might help. Would you mind reading this out loud? It is in our modern scriptures. I then pulled my scriptures off the shelf and opened to Doctrine and Covenants 64, 8 through 10. My disciples in days of old sought occasion one against another, and forgave not one another in their hearts. And for this evil they were afflicted and sorely chastened. Wherefore I say unto you that ye ought to forgive one another. For he that forgiveth not his brother his trespass standeth condemned before the Lord. For there remaineth in him the greater sin. I, the Lord, will forgive whom I will forgive, but of you it is required to forgive all men. It looks to me like you're blaming lots of people for what has happened, I said. And it's true that they caused the trouble. But what part of the problem are you going to solve by staying mad at everyone? Clay, somebody ought to make things right. I was left with the problems that Wendy created, and it derailed my career, not hers, Jack responded. I said, let me tell you about something that has happened in my church a number of years ago. A scout troop that our church sponsored, the scoutmaster abused twin 12-year-old boys. When their mother told the bishop of the ward, he quickly met with the scoutmaster, verified that it had happened, and then brought in the man's wife so that the scoutmaster could confess to her what he had done. In subsequent weeks, the man was excommunicated from the church and referred to the government authorities, where he confessed to all that had happened. This was devastating to everyone concerned. Several friends urged his wife to divorce him. Instead, she forgave him. They moved to a different state where they could start again. The mother of the twins, in contrast, was irate. If the bishop of the ward had been attuned to the spirit, he never would have asked that man to be the scoutmaster in the first place, she complained. As long as he is the bishop of our ward, I am not going to attend church again. She would not allow her children to attend either. After years had passed, I learned that in the town to which the scoutmaster and his wife had moved, church leaders determined that he had truly repented of his problems, and he was again baptized into the church. When the mother of the twins learned this, she announced, "This does it. If they admit people like him into the church, it cannot be guided by God." She asked that her name and the names of her twins be taken off the membership records of the church. She and her husband were subsequently divorced. The result, friends surmised, of her having become so bitter against everyone and everything. I asked Jack, who were the winners and who were the losers of this story? The winner, Jack realized, was the wife of the scoutmaster. Her family was stronger in every way because she could forgive and get to work solving the problems. And the big loser? I asked. Clearly it was the mother of the twins. Her feelings of injustice still boil in her heart. Her marriage dissolved, and she and her boys are alienated from God. I then read Doctrine and Covenants 64:10 again aloud and asked, God's language is pretty clear here. He reserves for himself the right to forgive and not to give whoever he wants. But for us, it is a blanket requirement. There are no set-asides, circumstances, or contingencies. We are to forgive everybody all of the time. Why is God so dogmatic about forgiveness? I asked. Jack started to cry. He has seen so many instances of people ruining their own lives when they will not forgive. God does not want this to happen to me. Jack then asked, I came looking for a job, and you talked about God. Why? I just do it when God can help us solve a problem, I responded. I think God truly is my Father and yours. He wants to help you. I would be foolish if I didn't use the best concepts or ways of solving a problem. Jack left with a spring in his step. He shortly found a great job and quickly wrote to ask me to write down the scripture we had read, so I can tape it on my desk, he said. I did so, and I also sent him a triple combination, writing above my signature, Just in case you ever need to screw your head on straight in the morning, read this. Speaking with love. My third example, a number of years ago, a number of students in my class at the Harvard Business School, for reasons that I could not figure out, truly did not enjoy the class. This was a new experience for me, as my courses had been quite popular with students year after year. I met with the disgruntled students individually and in groups, asking what I needed to change so that they felt like they were learning well. Each person put his or her finger on a different aspect of my teaching or the curriculum that they didn't like. It added up to a mandate that I needed to do everything differently. What made it more complicated is that most of the other students seemed to be quite happy with the course. I asked several more experienced members of our faculty to observe me teaching in hopes that they could find something that I needed to change, but they didn't see anything that merited significant overhaul. I was very frustrated. Our students pay a lot more to attend Harvard, and I have always wanted to give every student extraordinary value in every class. In the midst of this, on a flight to Minneapolis, I sat next to an elderly man who belonged to the Lakota Indian tribe. He was very wise. When he learned of my profession, he asked, "Is it fun to teach at Harvard?" I responded that it normally was, but that particular semester was trying. I explained what was going on in this particular section of my course. After patiently listening to me, he said, "The reason this is happening is that you are not teaching with love. You always need to teach with love." This was a profound comment that took me completely by surprise, as the concepts of teaching with love and the Harvard Business School case method probably had never been put together in any sort of free association exercise prior to this. But I realized that I, in fact, wasn't dealing with these naysayers in the forgiving, loving way that Jesus had advised. When I resumed teaching the next day, I remembered the man's wise words. I knelt in my office and prayed that God would help me teach with love, that the students might be able to feel God's love for them, emanating from me through the way that I had taught. Within a few days, the spirit of animosity just seemed to disappear in that class. It was replaced with a spirit of warmth, trust, and happiness, and many of the students in that group have remained close to me to this day. Many of them asked what happened in the class, and I told them of the wise counsel that I had received. I told them that every day before class, I prayed that the Spirit of God would be in our class. One of them, Rob, joined the church the next summer. Much of his motivation to seek out the church, he reported, came from the spirit that he felt in our class. That day, and prior to each class, I have taught since that time that I have followed the practice and knelt to ask God to help me in teaching. I have subsequently expanded what I pray for every morning, that every person I interact with that day will be able to feel my love for them and to feel God's love for them emanating from me. I continue to try to do this, and I'm grateful to say that I am periodically successful in this effort. I have never been asked by anyone to stop being kind or to stop helping others feel loved. Because I try to use LDS-related words in my normal conversation, everyone knows that these feelings are associated with our wonderful church. Science, academia, and religion. One of the most intolerant climates for discussion about religion is among scientists and academics. Although they fashion themselves in the most fair and open-minded of all people, in my experience, many in academia can actually be very biased and close-minded against truth. Many people are cowed into believing that because some of the most erudite among us disparage religion, academia and religion are not compatible, that they actually cannot be employed in the same conversation. Many treat religion as a second-tier stepchild when juxtaposed with scientific and academic inquiry, and many of us therefore conclude that bringing religious up in politically correct conversations will cause others to think less of us. I have decided that rather than framing such colleagues as intellectual opponents, I should instead view them as having been deceived by Satan, just as the rest of us often are. With this as my mindset, I can frame my interactions with colleagues as if we are always on the same side of any divide. Here is my logic. God did not say to us in the premortal existence, "Children, shortly you will go down to earth, and I want you to be very careful. When you get there, you're going to confront bodies of beliefs that they'll call science and academia. You will find these riddled with inconsistencies when compared to the truth about me, and the more you study, the more it will destroy your faith in me. So be very careful with science and academia. Learn as little of those things as you can." God did not say this. The great scientist Henry Eyring taught this principle over and over. Truth, from whatever source makes it known, helps us to become more like God. The evening before Henry was going to leave home to study engineering at the University of Arizona, his father, Ed Eyring, asked Henry to take a walk with him around the family's cattle ranch. He did not counsel Henry to learn selectively. Rather, he said, "In this church, you don't have to believe anything that isn't true. You go over to University of Arizona and learn everything that you can, and whatever is true is part of the gospel." The restoration of the gospel allows us to categorize things by truth versus falsehood, instead of science versus religion. This has made me unafraid. It helps me to instinctively draw upon those concepts from religion to solve problems in business and academia, as readily as I draw upon academic concepts to solve these problems. Ed Eyring helped me see that there isn't a hierarchy of types of truth. Scientific and academic pursuits are not superior in any way to truth that we learn from religion, and vice versa. Correctly defined, there is inherently not a contradiction. If we observe that academia and science on the one side and religion on the other are inconsistent, then one or the other is wrong or incomplete, or they are both incomplete or both wrong. But truth cannot be inconsistent with truth. We are on solid ground as long as we are humbly searching for the truth. The experiences I've had with coworkers at work, such as the experiences recounted in this chapter, are among the most exciting, rewarding missionary experiences of my life. These are some of the principles that I've extracted from these experiences. First, there are many people at work who believe in God and are anxious to talk about Him. Second, explaining what we believe is not the only way to explicitly share the gospel. We can use what we believe to help others understand and solve important problems. The model of testifying at work can be different from the model we use at church. We simply need to use the gospel. In fact, this is one way in which the Savior invited us to bear testimony. "If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself." That's John 7:17. Third, because of the truth works, there is no reason why we ever need to feel timid in using it. The gospel is extraordinarily flexible because truth is broadly applicable. We are able to draw upon the truths of the gospel to help resolve very different types of problems. Just as we have been taught to put footnotes in an essay, we use an idea from another person. When we use an idea from another person, we should simply be sure that our coworkers understand where the principles came from as we use the gospel to solve problems. Fourth, we should describe gospel principles in the same matter-of-fact tone of voice which we might draw upon the article in the Wall Street Journal or Science. Insight is insight, and truth is truth. There is no need to keep the language of religion segregated from the language of business, science, or academia. When we have a common language, our friends and colleagues at work can teach us things about religion and vice versa. And finally, fifth, just as we can put in our testimony meetings, our friends at our friends at work can feel the Spirit of God as we use the gospel. President Hugh B. Brown summarized these observations in this way: we don't need to defend the gospel in a military sense. Rather, we should do with religion as we do with music, not defend it, but simply render it. It needs no defense.